Hey, everybody, welcome. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar. Got about 40 folks in so far. We will probably end up around, we'll see, probably end up around 100 or so. Great to see everybody coming in. Hi I'm Sam. I'm in, everyone say where they're from in the chat. So, ooh, 2 people from Sweden. Hi, Mikael from Sweden. Hi, Emmanuel from Sweden. So I think we're both in California. I'm in Sacramento and Nikon's down in San Diego.
Sunny San Diego.
Nice weather down there. Okay, Colorado, Amsterdam, Australia, Layton, Australia, Bay Area, more San Diego folks, Canada, Texas and Wisconsin, Warsaw, Indianapolis. Yes, the recording will be available. We'll send out the recording. We'll send out the recording after this. Russia. Cool. We're a minute past the hour, so I think we can hop in and get started. And I'll kind of share. I'll share the screen here, and let's see. So thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to everyone for joining from all across the world. We're excited today to talk about modular web design, and so I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder, chief strategy officer at Gatsu, and joined by Nikon, CEO of WebStacks. WebStacks is one of our partner agencies. They've built a number of really high quality B2B websites, and so modular web design is kind of a topic that comes out of just thinking about the architecture of the site and how do we build better sites that sort of need less changes over time. And I think this is a topic that we've heard a lot from, and so excited to dive into it today. I'll kind of start off just by, architecture, right? There's a lot of different kinds of architecture when we think about what we need to do as we are building our websites, right? We're thinking about the technology that we're using. We're also thinking about, and so we've talked a lot about that, at various points in the past, but, there's also there's also just website specific things. So, okay, great. Here's the site purpose. What is the sitemap going to look like? What are the pages we need? What are the templates we need, right? Once we do the design, how do we break that design down into the right building blocks? And then how do we create kind of the content schema that allows marketers to have smooth workflows? And ultimately, these are things that really impact quality of life in terms of operating the site day to day, either as a developer or as a marketer, and ultimately play a large part in whether a website project is seen as successful or not. And so that's why, again, I think I'll start with this kind of story about how we tried to solve these problems. And I'm sharing this story not because I think we did a great job, but actually the opposite. I think we did an okay job. But I think the lessons that the problems that we ran into and the challenges that we ran into, we've heard other folks run into very similar challenges. And so actually, when I chatted with Nikon, that he kind of shared some of the things that he and his team has done to kind of avoid these, and we'll get to those a little bit later. But I'm going to share the story, and then you'll see that there's going to be a better way. So the problem was something that might sound familiar, right? We'd built a site, we'd been running it for a couple of years, our GatsbyJS.com site, and we just kind of custom built every page. And our marketing team was like, hey guys, can you give us some control over the website, right? We want to build pages ourselves without needing to bug you every time we need to make some tiny change, and we want to be able to make our own pages. And so we built this template that let them do that. And it, you know, it was a project that took a little bit of time, and I think it was a month or two, and the challenge was that, like, after we were like, okay, cool, we're done with this. So, you know, it turned out we actually weren't done, because we need to kind of keep going back and forth with change requests for a while, because it turned out what we built wasn't exactly what was needed. And so it just took a lot of time to go back and forth after that. And, you know, we still weren't, you know, we still aren't super like happy from like a content editing perspective. We're like, well, this is like, these are some of the content models that we needed to make the landing page that everybody signed up on today, or to get into this webinar. And there's a number of different content models you have to create. And so the content editor experience still could be a lot better. And so I'd give ourselves kind of a B- on this project. We didn't, and so, but so luckily, like, you know, there is a better way of doing this. Unfortunately, I don't think our experience isn't unique, because we've chatted with a number of folks that have run into sort of similar challenges in their journey to kind of empower the non-technical folks inside their organizations or inside their clients to kind of give them flexibility. So I just question for folks, you know, does this sound familiar to folks? And these might be slightly longer stories. So if you have stories, would be, you know, super curious to, okay, very, says Sterling. Any other responses? Definitely, says Jesse. Natalie says 100%. Anthony says he's dealing with this right now. Andrew Davis says yes. Edgar Cool says yes. And Juan says he needs a good framework to avoid falling into it. Okay, getting a lot of people resonating with this, and I'm so glad. Fernando says he's dealing with this right now. Okay, that's great. Okay, so I'm gonna like hand it over to Nikon and who's built some things to kind of show how to avoid to get an A result rather than like a B- result, or maybe an A+ result.
Yeah, let's hopefully get it to an A+. I think let's start here. Like, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with like traditional web design. I think peeling it back, looking at a high level, how the web design process, what the web design workflow looks like, and kind of what we're taught by Google, or like, you know, the traditional web design education process is like, you start with your wireframe and you move into the copy, then you hand it over to design, and then ship it off to development. And you're seeing all of these products as individual pages that kind of need to continuously go through this process every time you're shipping a website page. And the problem with that is that it's a very parallel process that's full of bottlenecks. You know, when you start the process, you're waiting on your wireframe, and then you're gonna have to go to your marketing team to get copy. Then you're gonna have to hand it off to design, and then shoot to development. And the problem with that is that in this like modern world, in the world of modern web design, you don't want to have a stringent wireframe, right? You want to be able to move things around. You want to be able to change copy, and giving the marketing team that agility to be able to do that is the whole purpose behind modular design. It's taking the website, breaking it up into reusable components, and essentially breaking down these bottlenecks that are contributing to slower workflows that you know, website teams are operating in right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and give you like a little bit of a visual of what we try to do at Webstacks and how we think the website should be. So what you're looking at here is Figma, and I love Figma. It's what our design team uses. It's a collaboration tool that bodes really well for this approach to modular design. They think of things as components. They have variations akin to like React components, and I'll kind of like dive into there in a bit. But what you're looking at here is you know, the standard subset of components that we would see for like a B2B landing page. And taking a couple steps back, like, websites aren't rocket science. These modules are very familiar across all of, you know, all the websites that you're seeing on the internet. The most successful websites kind of like use and adopt the same modules. Every website's going to have, you know, your hero component, your heading component, your card deck, you might have an FAQ accordion. it's not rocket science. The tools that the marketing team are going to need to build out pages. It's all about creating the structures, creating the process, and then, you know, designing it in a way that visually represents your brand. So what you're looking at here is these components in isolation. These are your Lego blocks. These are the building blocks of what will be kind of your landing page. And what Sam kind of hit on was the issue that the marketing team had was like, okay, maybe we started with these reusable components, but it was too strict, too stringent. And that's kind of like an issue that comes from the misalignment that, you know, marketing, design, and development inevitably have when they're not seeing the process in this way, right? If you're not clear on establishing variations and establishing guidelines and principles that the marketing team can use, they're going to keep coming back to you and asking for more initiatives. So forward thinking, it's important to say, hey, what are those constraints? What are those variations that the marketing team is going to need in order to have a successful website? And then you can always add on top of that. This is all about iteration and continuous improvement. So what you're looking at here is a hero component. And like I said, the reason why I love Figma so much is that it translates very, very well into, you know, the headless infrastructure and architecture. So if you see over here, you can kind of have these properties. The Figma calls them, they're very similar to what you would pass through a React component. But you could see from our design perspective, when we're designing out these components, getting started with a new website build, we're thinking about the variation. Dark mode. Maybe you want a hero instead of an image. Maybe you want to be able to adjust the heading size. So, you know, longer value propositions don't break across 8 or 9 lines. And like I said, the idea here is that we're forward thinking to the needs of the marketing team, ensuring that kind of they have the ability to build pages autonomously within guardrails that design approves of, and allows them to flex their creativity, because you don't want a page, you don't want all your pages on your website to look exactly the same. So you could see over the course of the development of your design system and these components, you could see kind of the variations change, the ability to kind of change the layout, how something looks to be, you know, centered versus split, or adapt to, you know, multiple items in a particular row, or even just reversing if the image is first or last. This is kind of like that flexibility that you want to provide from the beginning, forward thinking to what the marketing team would have, and then ultimately layer on variations as you go. So what this
Nikon, can you walk through sort of like what you call each of these components?
Yeah, I'm about to get to that. So what this ultimately, you know, comes into is a single landing page that is made up of various components. And what Sam is kind of like going to hit on right now is the importance of like governance of naming conventions within these components to have like an optimized workflow, right? There's a lot of times where like a development team might call a component content block, but the design team calls it 50-50 split. And that can in and of itself lead to so much friction and unproductivity within the team, because like they don't know what each component is, what it looks like, what it should be called, and that leads to kind of like friction in the design and development process. So what we've done is when we're building out a website, we kind of want to stick to like a dictionary, right? A set of components and terminology that everyone is going to be familiar with and can be reused from marketing team to design to development and everything kind of like in between. So what you're looking at here, you can see the naming conventions over here on the left-hand side, but traditional hero component. This is a heading component that kind of like divides up sections. This is what we call the card deck. And this component, the notorious switchback. And the reason why we call it a switchback is just because we've had so many different names thrown around across the board. We were like, let's pick something catchy, something that can catch on. And we're going to go with switchback. And it's had widespread adoption across B2B tech. So this is kind of like our process, and you can see, and instead of seeing each landing page, each website page as an entire initiative and an entire process dedicated to start from wireframe to launch, you're really thinking about how can we get something up and have the most agility using the components that we have. And if we need to add a new component to tell a new story or a new message, all you're really thinking is let's build that new Lego block and add it to the repository of components that you have. The other thing I want to hit on is like, this is great in a singular landing page environment, but these websites are made up of multiple templates. And another use case for having like this modular approach is adding that to something like a blog layout. So if you have this modular reusable architecture, you could start seeing things like embedding testimonials into your blog, your blog body copy, or adding a note, and really adding variation and flexibility across your other page templates, and reusing the components and content types and content models that you've kind of like created for the product pages or the landing pages that you're building. So you can see this same philosophy is used across multiple templates across the site, and you're able to adapt and form different visual layouts based on those content types. So you can see here, you're looking, this would be an image with a caption. Maybe you want a video. Maybe you want a CTA. These are all components that have already been, content modeled, established in your product pages, and just being reused in multiple use cases.
This is awesome, Nikon, and thanks for kind of sharing and walking through this this workflow. So there's a couple of questions that folks have popped in the chat, so I'll pop them over to you. So one asks, is that a custom Figma setup, or is it generally available?
This is a custom Figma setup, but the concepts are rooted in the philosophy of Figma. So you use these components is what Figma calls them. They're global components. If you want to edit them, you can edit them and kind of like adapt them and evolve them. And as you change and modify the global component, the optionality and variations push to all other pages within your Figma. So it's actually really, really powerful.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, yeah, and then I think that answers Threadpool Digital also had a question about that. So this is great. I want to, I'll call out a couple of things about these, about the components a little bit later. But I'll just say, like, I love going through watching you go through the, inside Figma and like mirror like what a designer would be thinking about of like, oh, let me tweak it this way or that way, and like sort of like watch the different variants in their head. Can you show maybe a couple examples? So this is of where this design is used on B2B websites that you've seen, either that you guys have built or ones that you've seen in the wild that you really admire.
Absolutely. Like I was hitting on, like the best websites are the ones that use modular design. It allows the flexibility, it allows the agility, it allows teams to be able to build autonomously without having to tie in design development every single time. So if you're looking at Calendly's website, this is a website that we built. It started out as a very, very basic website. Started with maybe like 2 or 3 components that didn't really allow for much variation across the board, and the marketing team constantly had to be chewing the development team to build out new features, new components, and adopting a modular approach to the website has increased their productivity across the board, and then ultimately like led to a better content experience for the marketing team, in which they can like produce pages that they're super proud of, right? Like nobody wants to build ugly pages. Like that's not a thing that any marketer is going to be proud of. They're going to do what they can given the guardrails that they've been put under. But making their lives easier and making them be able to produce work that they're proud of is another huge benefit of adopting modular design. So looking at Calendly's website, it's the same thing, the same set of components that you're going to see across the various pages that they have, kind of like adopt this idea of modular design and allowing variation. So this is the hero component. You saw the same hero component on the homepage. It just has, a different theme for a darker above the fold section. Gong, I think, is another great example because it's a site that has a lot of personality, but also kind of adopts this reusable architecture and framework. And it's flawless. In my opinion, like this is exactly what marketing teams need. And they've been begging for it. And the solution isn't going to like a Webflow or a Wix.com and having complete authority to just change the layouts of every single page, and every page looks different. It's like, let's have the design team put together some guardrails and adopt those guardrails to create a consistent, clean B2B website.
That's awesome. And you know, thanks for sharing and demoing, sharing those. You know, we get to see the Figma version, we get to see the live site version. Cool. So I'm gonna other questions and comments that folks have. Robin asks, what CMS have you found to adapt well to this completely modular approach?
I think the beauty of it is that the entire headless like ecosystem and the concept of headless is what bodes well to like building out these pages. So we've had success across the board with things like Dado, Contentful, and even had success with more visual tools like Builder and Storyblock. Like the tool itself isn't something that should restrict you from being able to adopt this process. It can be done with things like WordPress. It really is just about having alignment on your workflow and what your design, development, and marketing team's handoff process looks like.
That's awesome. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that as we a little bit later into the details. I think there's another couple questions of how exactly the architecture works, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But if let me I'll start sharing my screen again, Nikon.
Sure.
Cool. So here we go. So I want to kind of like, you know, Nikon shared sort of this demo, and I want to kind of abstract it out. So, you know, maybe principle zero that I didn't cover is kind of like the well-configured Figma setup that Nikon was sharing, but there's some other things, right? So don't hard code pages, right? Build these page templates, build React components, structure content inside your headless CMS. Give the marketing teams the flexibility that they need. You saw these like descriptive rather than generic components, right? You didn't see sections. You saw words that were descriptive of what this was. So it's a hero. It's a card deck, right? These things, we can talk about them, and they're concrete enough to be useful and to create good APIs that give, and this gets into we're going to get into the next one, but gets into like, gives you a meaningful number of options that you can give to the marketing team. The sort of the side note, which is that like these components are often going to be more related to the type of site. You're going to have different ones on an e-commerce site, right, than you're going to have in a B2B site. That's just the nature of the game, obviously. But you know, again, like this is the question here is, how do you have good API design? And the answer, and if you have good API design, if your components have good API design, then it makes it easy for the marketing team to customize that. And so, you know, you saw each of these components that Nikon was demoing, they had like 2, 3, 4 different props. There may be 2 options for each, or some of them maybe had 3 options. You know, that's because the APIs were like that well defined, it gave the marketing team flexibility without making them think too hard, right? Which is just the right sweet spot to be in. Is they're the ones that are in the CMS kind of, you know, feeding in the data for the concrete pages that they end up creating over time. And then the other thing is that I think, yeah, similarly, your component types just end up being related to the type of site that you have, right? And so this thing, the switchback is a great example of that. Like that's a B2B landing page. You know, we see that all the time for B2B landing pages. The last piece that I want to get into, and I think this is really sort of the mind-blowing part, when you sort of like, let's step out from the development and the design process and think about really the whole project workflow, right? And when we think about things in a modular way, and this is what really blew my mind when Nikon was sharing some of the things that they do with us, was that it actually changes the whole way the project gets built. And I'm going to hand it back over to Nikon to kind of demo to demo a little bit of how they scope projects, and I think that's going to illustrate how really the impact of modular thinking. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to you, Nikon.
Please do. All right, with my screen. Cool. Everyone see my screen?
Yep, you're good.
Cool. So yeah, we've like taken this modular approach and really applied it to, you know, our sales process, our CS process, our design process, kind of like our entire production process in an effort to be as modular as we can with things like pricing, with scope creep. And at Webstacks, we kind of like price our websites under the idea of modular design. So we've gone ahead and created this calculator that we share with prospects to kind of like put the power in their hands to get an idea of what it's like to work with Webstacks. And you might be, you know, depending on what kind of client we're working with and the maturity of their website, we have this, you know, nice handy autofill section that will autofill based on these variables, these knobs that we've kind of like identified after building hundreds and hundreds of websites in B2B tech that like adapt, right? So you have your base page templates, things like blog detail, case study, you know, this is an enterprise site, so they'll probably have things like reviews listing, podcasts, webinars. Like these are the same page templates that you're kind of like seeing in these content machines across B2B tech, as well as the website components, things like headers, footers, trust bars, you know, the switchbacks, testimonial sliders, all of those things, and put the power in the hands of the prospect to identify what do they need, what do they want, and if we can kind of like find a way to work together. Another thing that we do is illustrations and animations. That's like something that is very important to a B2B website, ensuring that you can visualize your product in a way that like isn't overly complex. So we've established kind of like variables and values that work for us as a business. So I'll go ahead and just like put some variables here. We'll go ahead and say this is a contentful website built using Gatsby, and we'll go ahead and calculate. And ultimately what this does, like I said, it puts the power in the hands of the prospect, lets them know how we price things. It's a radically transparent approach. We're not just, you know, going ahead and scoping something after 1 or 2 meetings and saying, you know, it's going to take 500 hours, 600 hours. It's really like we've established our process. We're very confident in how we deliver websites, and we productize it in a way that is palatable for our prospects. So oftentimes this also reduces the amount of time that Webstacks has to invest in scoping things. So from here, we can simply like spit out a proposal and, you know, we're good to go without having spent hours and hours and hours of scoping to get to this point.
I think this is super powerful for like you said, the visibility it gives the clients into the deliverables and being able to kind of break it down, like, you know, even before you see designs or anything. Like I can imagine just like looking at this as a prospective client or as a client and being like, okay, I kind of understand what I'm going to be getting. I know, you know, great header, footer, like card deck here. These are the components I'm going to have. These are like the page templates I'm going to have. These are the individual pages. Okay, great. Like here's my options. Like it's almost like build your own burger, right? Or or whatever, right? And like we feel like when we're doing that, we feel like we're in charge of the process, not sort of like, you know, not, and so I love how you've kind of broken that down and made it sort of visible.
Yeah, and it's great because like, you know, we kick off the project and maybe there's a desire to add a new component. It becomes very, very easy for us to scope new things and add new features to the website.
Yeah, great. So this is probably a good time to pause and just ask folks like what, you know, more sort of like what questions do you have about the process, about this modular design, these modular design concepts that we've talked about the process that Nikana shared.
I do want to drop in a link to an asset that we created. I'm seeing a lot of questions. I just got one in the QA section about naming conventions and how these work. So we actually just put together an asset. I dropped it into, oh no, I need to put it.
You got it.
Yep, I put it in there. It's essentially like an asset that we spent a lot of time putting together, explaining modular design, and a lot of the things are outlined there, like naming conventions and use cases for certain components.
Yeah, so one comments that it's my experience that designers like to have control of the process. And I think that sort of like touches on something, which is that, this process, in this process, it runs smoothly, but in some senses, like there's more constraints everywhere. Designers can't just design whatever they feel like because they have to work within the constraints of the sort of existing components and templates. But the nice thing is that actually makes everybody else's lives easier too, and it sort of makes the whole process smoother.
Right. Right. Designers do have a say in this process, right? It's like, as long as we're aligned on how we're going to be building and how we're going to be designing, they do have a huge say in how the website is ultimately going to be designed and delivered.
So Mark asks, for page templates, is there a library that can be seen when you hit the dropdown, or are you relying on the client to know exactly what they need?
Great question. So it's rather than seeing them as like more of a page template inside of the CMS, you're thinking of it as like one content model that holds all of your pages, right? So think of it as if you guys are familiar with like the headless infrastructure, think of your page template as a content model that takes kind of like your SEO metadata and then references all of the components that you have in your library. So you could rearrange the blocks however you want. Now, the internal marketing team might refer to a page template as like an industry page template or a product page template. And those are, more design related questions about what are the components that are going to be on an industry page versus a design page, but that's abstracted from the CMS. It's more of a marketing question.
Okay, and then Juan asks, do you have a standard file structure for components? I'm reworking how I place components in the project. I need to be able to quickly place new components.
Standard file structure for components. And yeah, typically we put them in the components folder and name them according to the name that's referenced in the CMS. So it's clean code. It's super easy to identify what component is what. But the important piece here is making sure that you are using reusable components even in React, right? You don't want to like continuously rewrite the same code over and over and over again and bloat your code base with technical debt. The idea is just like we're adopting like reusable component in design, you want to make sure that you're using the best principles of React to take advantage of how you're actually building your code base.
Okay, and Alexander asks if you reuse components across clients.
We reuse components across clients. Not typically. It's in some cases like you can definitely, increase your velocity by borrowing like a switchback that is kind of like identical to like on every website, it's really identical. You're just kind of like adapting global styles. But oftentimes the components are different, right? Because you want your design team to be able to have the flexibility to create new components across the different code bases. So in short, yes, for components that are generic, but for the more complex and ones that have more variation for a specific client, no.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth calling out that for the type of clients that you're working for, the design and look and feel of the site are a huge amount, and like being able to control that as part of their branding is a huge amount of what they want. These are, large B2B companies, and they're very sort of design sensitive and design centric, right? But I think the lesson is, the lesson for everybody though is that like these are also the kinds of clients that tend to have larger budgets as well. And so if you can serve those clients well, you'll see being able to land bigger projects.
It sounds like there's a few questions that are coming in around like the technical side, Sam. So I'd love to just quickly share my screen.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
So this kind of answers some of the questions around how we reuse projects and ensure that we're starting from like a good baseline. We use Storybook across all the clients that we work with. And that's important because it's a kind of like a playground for documentation as we're bringing on new developers. Like our developers know where what components are what props are what, and marketing teams, if they're bringing on, you know, developers from their side, it ramps up the velocity of them being able to like start making changes to the code base. So this is also an area where you're seeing changes that are mapped to kind of like the CMS. So you can see the heading here, we can kind of change things here, you know, heading size on desktop, you can change, you kind of see it in real time. And this is that playground that we kind of give the marketing team as well, as one of the pieces of the WebStack's website. And this is, again, like we have reused across when we're starting a website project, we kind of like clone from a GitHub template that we have, and it's a starter. All the documentation that we've spent across the years outlining kind of the atoms or the low level components, it kind of gets adopted into the new website, and it's a win-win. So
and worth calling out, this is the storybook, right? For your
this is storybook.
Yeah. Okay. And then Philippe and Matt are sort of singing the praises of the various CMSs. They've used Matt for Contentful and Philippe for Content Stack. Then there's some more sort of like kind of like longer questions, I think, specifically around how you translate your component architecture into a content structure in the CMS. How do you think about that when you're doing that, Nikon?
Great question. I think there's actually like another webinar we did with you guys about that. And the idea is that you need your design team and your development team and your marketing team to be on the same page, right? Like the design team needs to know what props are in Contentful. They need to know what the headless CMS is. They need to know how that works. They need to know the variations they have to account for. And like having that alignment across the board is so important. And oftentimes the content modeling itself is a UX question. The marketers are the ones that are using these content models, and it needs to be built in a way that's intuitive for them to use. Oftentimes, if you leave it to the developers, they'll literally throw HTML and React components inside of the content models. And rightfully so. If they're the ones using it, it's going to be, you know, the most optimal, but you don't want to do that for your marketing team.
Yeah, simple, straightforward content models, you know, understandable component names, right? API design is important because API design translates into, like Nikon said, your user experience, your end users being your clients, and that's ultimately your project success. Okay. Yes, Gurgly asks if we'll make this recording available. We'll be sending out an email with this recording. Okay, so thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate your time here. I mean, we could go way deep into this topic, but I think we've shared this kind of like compact overview. And again, there's that link. There's that link to the Modular Web Design sort of resource that Nikon and WebStax have put together. If you're interested in kind of reading more and going deeper into the topic, again, we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar as well. So I hope this has given everybody some tools and tactics to level up your design process and your content workflows along with it. So thanks again, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate you taking the time with us, and have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.